Poi ovviamente abbiamo il protagonista del film, Robert Downey Jr. Il regista Guy Ritchie e un altro dei produttori, Lionel Williams. Allora, prima di darvi la parola, vi ricordo che il film esce il 16 dicembre, quindi fra pochissimi giorni. Le copie saranno 600, quindi un'uscita importante. Credo che sia giusto anche ricordarvi che 2 anni fa, come ricordate, il film uscì il giorno di Natale, fu una sorpresa molto piacevole e in Italia fu l'incasso più importante di tutto il continente europeo, incassò poco più di 20 milioni di euro, e quindi in bocca al lupo ovviamente anche per questo secondo passaggio. Chi vuole cominciare? Prego. Adesso arriva il microfono, sta arrivando.
Sì, buongiorno, la mia domanda è per Robert Downey Jr. Nel film si dice che il matrimonio è la fine, come l'Armageddon, e si presuppone insomma che l'unico punto debole di Sherlock Holmes sia...
I don't know if mine's working. Try that again. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Ok. Il matrimonio è la fine, è l'Armageddon,
Sure.
e che appunto l'unico punto debole di Sherlock Holmes si pensa che sia una donna. Ecco, se personalmente condivide queste due situazioni. Grazie.
Well, we were just trying to think of funny ways to juxtapose that Watson's getting married and Sherlock doesn't like it. That's kind of one of the things that makes the movie work. Historically, in the Conan Doyle stories, he actually admires women very much, particularly a certain Irene Adler.
Chi ha il microfono ora? Io. Ok, ce l'ha Antonio. Prego.
Buongiorno, sempre da Robert Downey Jr., benvenuto a Roma. Intanto volevo sapere, il successo di Sherlock Holmes, secondo lei, è il fatto che riunisce in un mix da Batman a James Bond?
Well, I think first of all the success was Joel and Lionel thought to put Guy and I together. He had a really unique style and fresh approach to do essentially a Victorian mystery series. Historically, I'm pretty certain it's actually Conan Doyle's stories that have informed all of these mysteries and superheroes. I mean, there was Moriarty before there was Dr. No.
Io estenderei la domanda, se sei d'accordo Antonio, anche ai 2 produttori e al regista.
I don't really have anything to add to what Robert's saying. Sorry.
However, I do. First of all, spectacular being in Rome. Spectacular. So grazie. Yeah, Conan Doyle really created a very Bond-esque character way before anyone else was doing this in the film. 130 years ago, Conan Doyle went for this kind of broadly entertaining, in a sophisticated and quirky way. I feel as though if Conan Doyle was around today, he would have been a screenplay writer, and he was really way ahead of his time in terms of making something accessible, interesting, an intellectual action hero, and really that's kind of unique. And to think in that period, it really is quite fantastic. No one else was doing it at that period, and only Mr. Downey could have pulled it off.
I mean, when we started the project, Lionel, who had the idea to remake Sherlock Holmes, was always talking about a Guy Ritchie version of Sherlock Holmes. He was very excited about the idea that the fellow that had done Lock, Stock, and Snatch and Rock and Rolla would attempt an English story from the 1890s, a Victorian story, and you know, the idea was always to make it feel as fresh and contemporary as possible, which is what, you know, Guy and Robert were trying to do the whole time. And look, if it can have the audience as excited as a James Bond movie or a Batman movie, I'd be very happy about that. But I think that, you know, most of these movies come with one movie, and then if that movie works, they figure out a way to continue the story. But the Sherlock Holmes stories has always been serial fiction. It's always been multiple stories. And, you know, I hope that we can be sitting here one day talking about Sherlock number 23, like they're discussing Bond 23. And I mean, we'll all be a lot older, but we'll be happy to be here still.
Ok, non male, speriamo bene. Marco, prego.
Marco Spagnoli, volevo chiedere proprio su questo argomento a Guy Ritchie e a Silver, il fatto di aver scelto un autore del cinema indipendente per una serie, è quello che fa forse un po' la differenza. Spesso i blockbuster hollywoodiani sono un po' stereotipati anche nello stile, avere invece un autore che ha un background molto forte nel cinema indipendente, quindi anche uno stile, è una marcia in più. E lei prevede come produttore di produrre più altri franchise con questo approccio?
Well, that would be great if we could do that. I just think that Guy is a consummate filmmaker, and where he came from was kind of outside the system. But I think a lot of these directors, Chris Nolan and the Coen brothers, a lot of young filmmakers have come from outside the system. And once they reach a level where the studios feel comfortable with giving them a large amount of money, then they can attack, you know, kind of mainstream, you know, fare with a great original style.
Yeah, I think you're in a kind of unique period of film history, really, because independent films are waning, and quality commercial studio films are expanding. But to have the juxtaposition of an independent filmmaker, a real actor, in concert with money, it's kind of a unique time in film history, and I like being a part of it. I like this movie very much. I sort of feel as though it does have an independent flavour, but at the same time, you know, we've got deep pockets.
Prego. Ah, non è il microfono, sì. Sì, no, che fa. Penso di averlo.
Sono qui, here. Allora, volevo chiedere a Mr. Ricci qualcosa sui personaggi secondari. Vediamo in questo film c'è molto girl power, vediamo c'è il personaggio di Mary che ha un impatto più forte sulla storia, vediamo il nuovo personaggio di Sim, però volevo sapere come mai invece ha scelto, senza voler rivelare troppo della trama, come mai ha voluto mettere un pochino da parte il personaggio di Irene. Sempre parlando di personaggi secondari, invece volevo sapere qualcosa di più su Mycroft, il fratello di Sherlock, che era stato solamente accennato nel primo episodio, da dove è uscito fuori. Grazie.
How many questions was that? Was that about? No, is that am I dealing with the ladies first, and then am I dealing with Mycroft? Okay. Well, oh my God.
Guy had a late night. He was sipping water from the Fontana Trevi at about 3 in the morning.
It's true. Firstly, we felt it was very important to have girl power in the film. We felt as though there was quite a lot of girl power at times between Robert and Jude. But it was important that we have this strong female presence with Noomi. Hence, when we saw Girl with a Great Tattoo, we were very excited about it. She came in, she really meant it, we wanted to give it to her, but we felt as though we did need a strong female in not an obvious or typical fashion in this film. But also that the whole thing about Irene Adler is we are invested in Irene Adler, and it's very hard with someone like hold on, who am I dealing with now? Am I dealing with Rachel McAdams? Okay. The thing is, to deal with someone like, in order to deal with Rachel, you've really got to deal with Moriarty. because Moriarty, you're dealing with one of the most famous or infamous villains in the history of literature. Now, at the same time, he's innocuous. So he's supposed to be innocuous. In order not to make him innocuous, but keep him innocuous, I'm afraid she was the first on the list to go. And that worked, but we knew we were going to lose Irene halfway through the first one. So that's sort of how, by the way, I could talk about this for some time. I've got a feeling I'm going to be able to hold your attention for some time. Now, is there anyone? You can talk about Kelly Riley.
And we love the actress Kelly Riley. We thought she did a wonderful job in the first movie, and we wanted to make Mary Watson's wife a much stronger character. I think we succeeded in this movie. And Mycroft, well, we all love Stephen Fry. We think he's the perfect Mycroft. Mycroft, of course, was Sherlock Holmes' cleverer brother in the books, and a wonderful character, and we felt that we owed it to Conan Doyle to include him in the movie, and I think he came across brilliantly.
Ok, ci siamo. Pierpaolo.
Sì, buongiorno. La stessa domanda sia per Downey Jr. che per il regista Guy Ritchie. Il vostro Sherlock Holmes rimarrà indubbiamente nella storia del cinema sia per un punto di vista qualitativo che per il risultato commerciale e saranno in pochi, nonostante i tantissimi Sherlock Holmes, forse centinaia, che sono stati fatti sia per il cinema che per il teatro. La vostra peculiarità, secondo voi, è aver affrontato il classico, insomma, rileggendolo e mettendolo da parte, o usando appunto dei punti chiave da dover rispettare pedissequamente?
Excellent question. A Game of Shadows is, at its core, a extrapolation of his final problem, which was the Conan Doyle story where Sherlock faces off against Moriarty. So whenever we were at an impasse, we knew that it had to have more breadth and scope, but whenever we were kind of at a loss for what direction to best take, we would look back at the stories. You know, when you're talking about a big cinematic experience, I think Doyle actually really served us well. There's probably 20 direct quotes, and oftentimes, I'm the guy who always says you can't do things better than the way they really happen, whether that's a biopic or the reality of what's in the stories of Conan Doyle.
Okay.
Same question.
Prego.
Salve, io ho una domanda per il signor Ricci e la estendo anche ai traduttori. Ho notato che nel film, come il mio collega, ci sono notevoli derivazioni dal cinema di James Bond. Questo collegamento, diciamo, tra personaggi era già presente nel fumetto di Alan Moore, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, dove i personaggi della letteratura vittoriana prendevano ordini da Champion Bond, che è un antenato di James Bond, e in effetti il nemico è Moriarty. E visto che nel film ci sono alcune atmosfere che rimandano al romanzo, al graphic novel di Moore, volevo sapere se era stato preso in considerazione o se era una casualità, se l'avete letto, se vi è piaciuto. Grazie.
I'm definitely a fan of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and of course James Bond. Grew up on James Bond as a kid. But if there was any influence, it wasn't conscious. This really originally came from what the images that I saw in my head when I was reading the Conan Doyle stories. And that's how I came up with my own comic book about it, which ultimately turned into the film. I think Guy and Joel and Robert, everybody here sort of somehow had that shared that same vision, made it better, expanded on it, and that's how we are where we are. And I think now we've built on our own previous film, and we're constantly trying to find different and clever ways to entertain the audience, bring brilliant action, increase the characters. If you look at all of Guy's movies, the secondary characters are very important in terms of the relationships between them. That's a very important part of it, and that's what it is.
Allora c'è Annalisa, vi ho chiesto se conviene così.
Buongiorno, volevo chiedere a Robert Downey Jr. e anche al regista Io ho visto Robert Downey Jr. molto appassionato a questo progetto, mentre altre volte non lo era in altri film. Quindi volevo chiedergli quanto ha portato a questo personaggio e che cosa esattamente, e dove è entrato invece Guy Ritchie, cioè come si sono concertati su questo personaggio e qual è stata la cosa più difficile da realizzare su questo film. E poi, mi scusi, ma c'era una citazione di Heath Ledger in The Joker? Lei è truccato in un modo che lo ricorda ad un certo punto. Grazie.
Well, first of all, I was thinking about Robert Smith from the band The Cure. I'd also like to say, speaking of girl power, there's a missing integer here today, which is our other producer and my wife, Susan Downey. And I think to talk about Sherlock Holmes and our collective passion for it is to discuss and speak a little bit about the process, you know. And I think one of the great things that happened, and I'd love it if Lionel and Guy and Joel joined in on this a little bit. I think the result of what people are seeing and enjoying during these screenings and with the soon coming release of the film is there is an experience of a group of people who had immense respect for each other, who would quarrel like little children, who would sometimes not speak to each other because we were so passionate about what we wanted this film to be, and who ultimately kept following the threads of what we believed the films we enjoyed. Particularly, we were talking about sequels. We're talking about why is it that the second movie in a series almost always sucks? And how can we really support each other, and how can we keep going back to the source material and keep innovating and keep writing and rewriting and thinking? And oftentimes we would get to the set. A prime example is there's this scene where Watson is pretty hungover and he's got to go get married. And we had written this version of the scene and written that version of the scene, and we got there on the day, and Guy decided that it should all be done without a word. And I think it's one of the more effective little sequences in the film. But does that make sense to just talk a little bit about the process and how we worked?
Yeah, I think there was such enthusiasm from the creative team, which is, I think, shared sort of in Italy for Sherlock Holmes. Again, you know, 100 years later, and somehow he still remains an enigmatic character that we're all still interested in. And really, we wanted to make these films fundamentally from a creative point of view, and that's what was primary. And the enthusiasm of that is really what was the momentum behind everything. It was enthusiasm behind everything, and it did mean we quarrelled quite a lot. But you know, we're happy with what we achieved, and everyone was complicit in this film creatively.
Robert's wife, Susan, who's not here because she's pregnant, and she's due in several months. She worked with me for many years, and we've done many films together. And the last time we were here was for the Brave One, that we did with Jodie Foster, which we were here together for, Susan and myself. And you know, she has always been, you know, like a dog with a frisbee with a script. I mean, she won't let that script go. And I saw an email the other night where she had said to the studio they were trying to fix a kind of a TV spot, and she said, "I can't help myself, but you just change one shot." But we all, you know, believe that this movie could be special, and that's what we're trying to. Here we have a snappy 1890s movie, and we're trying to make it feel fresh and original, and everybody has their own idea how to get there. And through a very, you know, complicated, explosive process, we find our way to a thing that we're all proud of. And in the world of making sequels, and I have to say I've done a lot of sequels, which I like to do very much, and I've always said I'd like to try to find a way to make a sequel without the first movie, but at this point, I think this is the best sequel we've ever done. I mean, I think it's fun, it's fresh, and it's really a great holiday family movie.
And before we go to Lionel, I think for everybody to have finally realized at the end of the day that if they just listen to what I say, everything is going to turn out perfectly. Lionel?
What can I say? I would say that led by Robert and Guy, we would get to the set every single morning and Robert would say, okay, this is good, but how can we make it better? And we would deconstruct the scene and work on the pages, work on the script, work on every line. We'd rewrite it, then we'd get on the set, and then Guy would go, wait a minute, how can we make this better? And we start all over again, this time with the actors and the DP and everybody, once again to make it better. And I think that's why films turned out the way it is.
Sì, volevo fare una domanda a Guy Ritchie che era molto semplice, forse arriva a quello a cui stiamo un po' girando intorno. Che cosa risponderebbe esattamente se adesso si alzasse una persona che gli chiede perché non c'è Sherlock Holmes con la lente di ingrandimento e la mantellina? E questa è quella per Guy Ritchie. Quella per Robert Downey è in questo film mi sembra che l'aspetto wild, selvaggio. Mi sembra che in questo film l'aspetto selvaggio di Sherlock Holmes, il suo gusto per i travestimenti, i trucchi, così, il suo camminare insomma, sul lato selvaggio della strada sia abbastanza sottolineato rispetto anche all'altro film, e se questo lo ha interessato, gli è piaciuto e perché. Grazie.
To answer the first question, there was never a deer stalker or a hack, although I'm very fond of deer stalkers. There was never one in the books. So, Arnold and I made up very early on that this Sherlock Holmes wasn't going to have the aesthetic of the tradition of Sherlock Holmes, which wasn't necessarily authentic anyway. So we came out of the slips in the respect that we wanted it to appear. We wanted the aesthetic in general just to seem fresh.
Well, first of all, I hear that for the most part Italian journalists don't come out in large numbers on Sunday, so I'd like to really thank you for that. By the way, I love all these long weekends you have here, these holidays, and maybe America should become just a little more Catholic. We'd probably do better. As far as the disguises go and stuff like that, and I agree with Guy, it's remarkable. You look in the books and you go, oh my God, he never had a big pipe like that. He had a short little clay pipe, or he wore a moleskin cap and never a deerstalker. These are things that happen later in other TV and film productions. But I did say at a certain point, I think we've been shooting for like 2 weeks or something, and I said, there are nowhere near enough disguises. I need like 5 more disguises. Starting with, I think on the train, the most off-putting, disgusting thing Holmes could appear to as Watson's wife Mary as would be in drag, because that would just really just disgust her. So let's do that. And I remember initially you were like, oh, you don't want to do that, Robert. And now you're very happy that I did not. Did you think I was just dying to cross-dress?
Well, I certainly know you were just dying to cross-dress. But it had a sort of symbiotic relationship, it worked, yes.
Buongiorno, io ho trovato molto sottolineato, mi è sembrato, il fatto che tra Holmes e Watson non c'è un semplice rapporto di lavoro, ma c'è una relazione d'amore, cioè Holmes non tralascia occasione per manifestare il suo amore per Watson. Ecco, avete voluto dare alla storia un po' anche questa connotazione, diciamo, di amore gay platonico, ma insomma, in qualche modo amore.
We were inspired by the books. They are best friends. They are male friends. Holmes is a man who lives in his head. He has difficulty relating to other human beings. The one person he can relate to in his life is Watson. That comes directly from Arthur Conan Doyle. We simply built on that.
Okay. Prego.
Salve, Paolo Testa, di Punto. Domanda per Guy Ritchie. Lei ha scelto Stephen Fry per interpretare Mycroft. Ci può parlare di questa scelta e lo ha fatto spogliare totalmente in una scena, se Stephen Fry era contento di questa cosa. E per quanto riguarda Downey, come siete diventati fratelli? Downey? Come siete diventati fratelli? Come vi siete preparati? Tra l'altro anche lei si spoglia nel film. You two get naked in the movie.
From what I remember, we have a mutual friend, Chris Martin, the chap out of Coldplay, who's a real Sherlockian, and Robert and I had dinner with him, and it was his idea actually that Mycroft should be played by Stephen Fry. I think in a different time he either would have played Moriarty or Sherlock Holmes. Stephen Fry, he was another Sherlockian. These guys, I fancy myself as a Sherlockian, and I realised I was dwarfed by their enthusiasm. So it was actually Chris Martin's idea. Robert thought it was great, I thought it was great, and he's great fun to deal with. Very intimidating intellectually until you take his clothes off.
Salve, io ho una domanda per Robert Downey. Quello che mi ha colpito, Quello che mi ha colpito molto del film è come tu sei riuscito a muoverti con le arti marziali. Volevo sapere se tu per caso hai fatto qualche corso a parte oppure ti muovi nel combattimento con velocità, facendo diverse mosse di arti marziali in maniera particolare. Grazie.
Oh God. You've asked that question, we could be here for some time.
This is probably the most important question anyone will ask. Part of what made the first movie work was something we shot for 2 days in Chatham in this little bare knuckle boxing match. It was an introduction to Holmes. It was a juxtaposition to how he feels when he's created a rift between Watson and his fiancée. And so we always wanted to use the fighting as almost kind of like an emotional counterpoint to make things more physical. And Guy Ritchie actually is a very, very good jiu-jitsu practitioner, and I'm a Wing Chun Kung Fu guy. And Holmes was a bare knuckle boxer and a single stick fighter and a master. We'll have to do this next time. Something that doesn't exist called baritsu, which is kind of an English jiu-jitsu. So we never wanted it to go into Hong Kong Fooey, and we never wanted it to seem like we took Warner Brothers money and all we wanted to do was butch it up. But you know, the action is an important part of the film. And as far as me moving gracefully, wonderfully, being lithe as a cat and a very, very dangerous man, I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Prego.
Marco Accordi Rigars per Empire Italia. Una domanda per il regista e una per
Se ti alzi in piedi forse ti vedono meglio, scusami.
Una domanda per il regista e una per Robert Downey Jr. Per il regista volevo chiedere, molti hanno fatto notare giustamente come ci sia una sterzata verso le atmosfere e le tipologie di trame di un film di James Bond. Volevo sapere, non credete che si corra il rischio di diminuire troppo la parte investigativa e quindi far venire meno le indagini e le deduzioni tipiche di Sherlock Holmes? Seconda domanda invece per l'interprete principale. Pensa che lo Sherlock Holmes da lei interpretato possa essere un rivale del capitano Sparrow di Pirati dei Caraibi, perché c'è una tipologia di personaggio che è competitiva secondo me da quel punto di vista.
Well, first of all, Johnny Depp and I are friends. Second of all, you know, it's funny, you know, there is this zeitgeist that's always going on. Everyone's kind of consciously or not feeding off each other. I think the interesting part of your question is, are we going to lose what's great about the Conan Doyle stories by going, you know, big and badass and thinking all this action? And the answer is we certainly could, and that's a danger. We actually are already talking about the possibility of, particularly with Italy being one of our largest markets, talking about the possibility of the European countries and the American market and countries abroad giving us an opportunity to do another Sherlock. And we're very, very much on notice that a return to the proper procedural investigative aspect of the duo and of the storytelling and of the way that what made the books and the stories so numinous and so exciting is probably likely to be a big part of what we would do given another opportunity. So we haven't addressed that yet, but trust that we might.
I think you answered that very eloquently indeed.
Eccomi. Una domanda per Robert e Guy. Uno degli elementi che ha reso vincente il primo Sherlock è l'alchimia tra i due protagonisti. Questa alchimia qui si perfeziona e sono qui e anche qui è uno dei punti fondamentali, il più divertente e il più anche emotivo, in maniera molto, molto mascolina ma molto emozionante. Veramente c'è questa bella amicizia, questa bella alchimia e sembra che l'alchimia ci sia anche tra Jude e Robert. Voglio sapere da Robert se come è riuscito a creare questo meccanismo perfetto con Giulò, e da Guy Ritchie cosa c'è di suo, come li ha aiutati a realizzare questa ottima performance.
There was a director who once said that 90% of directing is casting, and to a degree that's true. So once Robert was chosen, it seems ridiculous that we could have chosen anyone else for Sherlock Holmes now. It was really a question of finding a suitable partner. So it took a while before we got there, but I was sure what Robert wanted to be, Robert was sure what Rob wanted to be, he was sure about that character initially, and then as soon as Jude came on board, it took us about 30 seconds to know exactly where we were going to go. And we enjoyed the role of, we as the team, as the creative team, enjoy the sort of flirting that takes place between Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. It's really the heart and the soul of the films. It's vulnerable at the same time, they're rather butch. So they had this kind of interesting juxtaposition, but we were all very sure about how that would work, and we cared so much about it. I've got to tell you, it's fun for me as a director to work with guys like that, because they sort of lead the charge, and all I've got to do is just steer the head of the tiger. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, the other missing integer here today, obviously, is Jude. He's shooting Anna Karenina in London with Joe Wright at present. But I honestly don't think that we'd have been here doing a second film if people hadn't responded to Guy's casting. And then I think Lionel and Joel and Susan really wanted to capitalize on that and have it be the center of the story. Usually it's the first thing to get lost, particularly when you return and try to continue a series. Is you go, well, let's make it bigger, better, this and that, and we were hell-bent on expanding our relationship and deepening it. I think particularly what tends to suck is the third act of a second installment of what was otherwise a pretty good movie going in a fun direction. And so we were really wanting this time to be Watson, like in the books, is recanting a very painful, very exciting, very mysterious story of what happened to him and his friend. And I think that really roots it in you know, the depth and passions that you feel in a close friendship.
Credo che sia Nicoletto.
Nicoletta Gemmi primissima, una curiosità per Guy Ritchie, solo una curiosità prima, ritornando alla domanda su Stephen Fry, Chris Martin che ha nominato il leader del Coldplay?
Yes.
Velocissimo. Prego.
Buongiorno, due domande per Robert Downey. Lei da 2 o 3 anni, pur essendo un attore estremamente versatile in tutta la sua carriera, è legato a 2 personaggi, a 2 serie che hanno un grandissimo successo, quella di Iron Man e Sherlock Holmes. Cosa la stimola a continuare a portare avanti questi personaggi? Di Tony Stark oltretutto lo vedremo sia in Iron Man 3 che in The Avengers. E poi, siccome si parla da un po' di un suo ritorno a un film più intimista, se l'occasione sarà il film di Paul Thomas Anderson da Pynchon, o se realizzerete prima uno dei film che volete realizzare con sua moglie. Grazie.
I lost both of them. There you I was enjoying listening to your voice, and I such a chanting language. What did she say? Let's take a lunch break. No?
The two main characters for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Are you going to keep doing that? Right. And are you thinking about other movies?
Oh, okay.
Oh,
right. There's I think it's a Crosby, Stills and Nash song called "Love the One You're With," and it's really hard for me to think or talk about those other things when I'm so focused on the Sherlock series. I do know that this feels like the group of co-workers and the kind of character that I could do indefinitely. Sooner or later, how many times can you be a butch action hero without looking like you need to retire? And as far as other films, we're all always looking for other stuff to do.
Allora, Maurizio, l'ultima domanda, mi scuso con tutti i colleghi che si sono prenotati, perdonatemi, come sapete il tempo è ancora. Prego Maurizio.
Buongiorno, una domanda combattiva, va sull'aspetto registico, produttivo del film. Sono rimasto abbastanza colpito, adesso anche metaforico, dall'uso del concetto di armi nel film. C'è la scena dell'inseguimento nel bosco e in altri momenti, se ricordo la torre, sapete perfettamente a cosa mi riferisco. Poiché siamo in fine di XIX secolo e di lì a poco, c'è anche una battuta nel film, arriveranno cose in Europa molto terribili, quindi guerre, un certo tipo di armi. Volevo capire come vi siete relazionati, non sono un esperto, mi incuriosisce capire il rapporto fra armi verosimili, CGI e qualcosa di in qualche modo avveniristico che avete anticipato. Siamo nel 1891, magari c'è qualcosa che verrà fuori nel 1910. Che studio, che lavoro avete fatto dal punto di vista di ricerca e produttivo? Perché è una parte molto importante e davvero molto spettacolare, quindi volevo capire quanto filologicamente è stata seguita. Grazie.
Well, obviously we were inspired by history. World War I happened very shortly afterwards, and the concept of the movie was the idea that Moriarty was trying to bring about World War I 25 years before it happened. We did research the weaponry extensively. You'll find that all the weaponry, whether it's machine guns, whether it's the cannons, are all based on real prototypes that were perhaps designed, came out maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, okay. but they're absolutely historically correct.
Okay. Gary, do you want? No, it's okay. Okay, io ringrazio tutti i nostri ospiti, naturalmente ringrazio voi, mi scuso con i colleghi che non avete fatto la domanda.